Hello and welcome to ET India Boardroom. On this panel, we'll be discussing customer experience in financial services. Our panelists for today are Vishal Gupta, Head of Product at PhonePe, Apurv Kumar, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Refine, and Nitya Sharma, co-founder and CEO at Simple. Thank you to Nitya, Vishal, and Apurv for joining this session, this panel discussion on customer experience and the role of customer experience in financial services, and specifically the role that fintechs have played in disrupting customer experience and how you think about customer experience. As we know, customers have increasingly demanded simple, intuitive, seamless digital experiences. And this has been the trend in BFSI as well, especially on the retail side, but now we're beginning to see that with corporate customers as well. And in financial services, we're seeing a lot of what we call contextual parity play out, where customers don't just compare your products and services with other banks or insurers or NBFCs, but also with a consumer tech company and an e-commerce company and the neighborhood coffee shop. And from the supply side, this is where fintechs have really disrupted the market by redefining customer experience across payments, lending, insurance, and investments. We're also seeing from an infrastructure and regulatory perspective, after UPI, now some major interventions by the regulator to digitize and democratize financial services with account aggregation, the open credit enablement network, and so on. And this trifecta of drivers has been given a further impetus by COVID. What we are here to discuss today in this context is how three leading fintechs, especially in retail payments and lending, and at different stages of their growth journey. PhonePe, who is now a clear leader in retail payments and what many would call a super app. Simple, who is a pioneer in buy now, pay later. And Refine, who is now a clear leader in the earned wage access market. But the one thing we see that is common to all of them is how they are reimagining customer experience and how that has been a key differentiator to all of them. So welcome, gentlemen. And why don't we get started with some opening remarks on how digital journeys and digital experiences have become the primary grounds for disruption in any industry, but especially financial services and more specifically retail payments and lending, and how fintechs have really led the charge on this. And why don't I start with you, Nitya, since you're first on my screen. Why don't you talk about this, and then we can go around the room and get others to pitch in as well.
Thanks, Rakesh. Great to be on this chat, and nice to meet Vishal and Apurv. As you said, Rakesh, the consumer that we are talking about, which is a native to mobile, native to internet consumer, and the most wrong way to define that customer is an Indian customer or a tier 1 customer or tier 2 customer. This is the internet customer. And by default, that means they're used to the best consumer experiences across the board on the internet that is available. So that customer knows what Airbnb looks like, and Uber looks like, and Amazon looks like, and Flipkart looks like, etc. And one of the things I always say about consumer experiences is oftentimes they're like magic, right? You press a button and a car shows up to a house. You swipe right and you can go on a date, and so on. And that's sort of like the standard that the consumer is used to. And forget about financial services, which is obviously very, very much consumer. Even enterprise products are becoming very sophisticated in terms of consumer experiences. So obviously financial services, therefore, that's table stakes, right? That is a starting point. And obviously there is a lot of innovation going on in India, around the world, to make financial services intelligent, easy, intuitive, and simple. At Simple, we obviously call ourselves Simple because we truly believe in that philosophy that it is important, money is important, how you spend it and where you spend it, and how easy and intuitive it is to do so. At the same time, you need trust while you're using or spending your money or doing anything with money. And how could you use data science / machine learning, engineering, and design to provide that experience to consumers that is what we say is almost like no experience, right? We are obviously in the payment business. And one thing we like to say about the experience that we think about is that the best payment experience is no experience, right? It's almost like no one is asking for the experience of payments, and therefore the zeroness of it is the value. And obviously, to make it happen, it's hard, very complex, and you have to build a lot of engineering and things to make that possible. Yeah, so that's sort of like how we think about it. It's table stakes. It's where it starts. Everything else follows, and consumers do not discriminate or do not differentiate between financial services or some other app. They're just used to the best, and that is just like click, 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 swipe, 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 and they just expect a lot of personalization.
And one of the areas where we saw this happen first from a fintech perspective was obviously retail payments, given how UPI really took off. And we saw the transition from cash to UPI, from wallets to UPI, and so on. So from a PhonePe perspective, Vishal, how important and significant has customer experience been? And how have you thought about that at various stages of your journey? You've been around for a long time now.
Sure. Thanks, Rakesh. Hey, hi, Nitin. Hi, Apurva. Hi, Nitya. Nice to catch up with you guys. See, I think what Nitya was alluding to, right? Digital experience is table stakes. So customers are expecting to be able to do what they want to do on mobile devices, as simple as that. India's leapfrog completely in terms of the interfaces or the communication channels, what they use. We are the largest consumer of the data. And if you think about even in terms of the penetration of the smartphones is going, I think, way more deeper in tier 3s and tier 4s and way beyond in terms of the affordability also, if you think about. Around $100 devices are available and lots of people are basically onboarding onto it. It is very interesting to know that how it is cutting across geographical as well as economical boundaries. And that's where basically it becomes a very, very interesting problem statement or a huge challenge for everyone to solve, right? You need to build for, if you think about lowest common denominator, but at the same point in time, it has to be delightful for everyone around. And how do you find that lowest common denominator where basically what Nitya was again alluding to, no experience or a very, very seamless experience where it is so intuitive for people to kind of interact with and then basically land there. It becomes super critical. And if you think from a digital journey of any customer experience, right? Typically they start with a content consumption, which will be largely around social or some kind of media. But then the first thing where they come on board is pretty much, if you think about transaction and payments, is one thing where basically we are getting more and more people into the customers, into the ecosystem. With 375 million registered users, 80% of our base is coming from T2 and below, right? Yeah. And I think that becomes super critical to, I think, design it in a way where it is simplistic, very, very intuitive, and even crossing the language barriers for that matter, right? So while you can go towards localization, but you need to understand that I think how simple interfaces are designed and the predictability and the habit forming nature of them, right, becomes super critical to be able to build the interfaces which will be loved by your tier 1 customers who are using apps which are way more complicated, and loved by someone who's coming on board for the first time and basically start using your payment app like once every day. And yeah, I think it's super critical to understand the entire heterogeneous nature of the consumer base and figure out the right formula to be able to meet demands of elite as well as masses.
Thanks, Vishal. Coming to you, Apurv, yours is a slightly different situation where I guess customer experience here is not just for the consumer, but for corporates as well that you would be targeting. So how has that journey been, and how have you thought about customer experience from your market perspective?
Absolutely. Hi, Vishal. Hi, Nitya. Great to meet you guys. Great to be on this chat. So thank you, Rakesh. We are in a very interesting position in the market at this point. Now, like Vishal and Nitya mentioned, there has been a tremendous amount of disruption in the last 10 years, whereas there are still some bastions of legacy systems still being very, very predominant. And the entire salary mechanism has actually been one of them. Is that like no one has questioned why 30-day cycle, right? So that's where we came in. But to your point of how do we work with both on the consumer side, on the enterprise side, again, one of the interesting parts that we deal with is both of them are ultimately our clients. We have to think about when we are designing products, we have to think about both of them from a very, very different perspective. If it's a single user approach, a single user platform, like if someone has an app, it's very private and it's accessible only to them. Whereas if we are designing something for the enterprise, it's typically a shared platform. Although everyone will have a unique accessibility to it, the HR team member could have one set of accesses to it. The accounts team members will have one set of accesses to it. So that adds an extra dimension of complexity to our enterprise side of the products. On the consumer side, something that Vishal also talked about is that audience in India is not a monolith. For that reason, anywhere in the globe, they are not a monolith. There is a lot of heterogeneity there across demographics, age brackets, but India more so because of the language. Very few countries can boast the diversity of languages that we have, and that adds another dimension of complexity. One very interesting thing that you don't realize until you actually start building the platform is that the font are not only something that you need to translate and you're done with the app. You have to think about how big the fonts are actually. So the same word that could fit in a particular space in one language will not do so in a different language. So everything essentially acts like a new app. You have to test it from scratch. You have to make sure that the experience does not change, that so some languages have relatively longer words, some have relatively smaller. So ultimately, how do you try to provide the uniform experience that you intended to across languages becomes a very, very interesting challenge. But that's the strength that the entire Indian app ecosystem is starting to gain at this point, because it has been built to be so configurable from day one, because not having multiple languages is not an option, whereas you do have that option, right? So one very interesting thing we came across is when our counterparts across the globe, when we talk to them, they are launching across different countries, right? And they are thinking about, okay, now we have to change the app to meet that, localize it to that country. Whereas when we think about our product, if we wanted to launch it in a different country, it's not much of a change, except for probably the regulatory aspects, because the Indian apps are designed from that, like that from day one. So we are, in the entire Indian app ecosystem, interestingly, is very uniquely positioned to actually start offering these services to a lot of other countries compared to what other countries' ecosystems are.
Very interesting. I'll come back to that point, but now I want to get a little bit more specific about your own individual businesses. Let me go back to you, Vishal. PhonePe, as we all know, is now a clear leader in retail payments. And like I said, in many ways, you are an incumbent already. You're not an insurgent anymore. Just from a tenure perspective, I guess. You started with a slightly different strategy of app in app, which was fairly new to the Indian market at that stage, at least. Of course, we've seen that in China. But what I really want to understand was, doesn't that complicate customer experiences rendered in your own ecosystem? And how do you address that challenge? And secondly, at this stage of your journey, how do you make the right trade-offs and balance between customer acquisition versus engagement versus monetization? So those two questions from a PhonePe perspective would be really interesting to understand.
Sure, Rakesh. I think goes without saying, and it's a cliched statement, but customer obsession is the key mantra for whatever you're trying to solve for, right? Be it complicated information architecture, or be it in terms of figuring out what are the right trade-offs. It is always the customer which you need to be thinking about the first, right? If you are able to understand your customer needs and to be able to find those right gaps, I think as long as you're doing right by that, it is fairly, I think, things will fall in place, right? Of course, you can make multiple mistakes beyond that also. But one thing which is non-negotiable is, are you putting customer interest on the first? And that has to be part of core DNA. I think that's where basically probably fintechs, right, or the new age companies, I think, has an advantage over the incumbents. We are far away from incumbent for that matter. So I think that's one thing, right? And second thing, if you think about from a complicated offerings, as I was trying to allude in my earlier this thing also, when you're building customer experiences for a very, very large base, I think how you think about your information architecture, right? How you think about the interfaces, what you're developing becomes super important, right? It has to reflect in terms of what do you mean, for the customer, right? If you think about PhonePe, we have always, right, from a very early days decided that, hey, we stand for basically accelerating every customer's journey when it comes to money, right? And when we look at money relationship with the customer, it's like send, spend, manage, grow. And if you try to look at our app actually reflects that information architecture fairly clearly, right? There's a like send, spend, which is basically P2P money transfer, recharge payments, and all those kind of store payments. Then you have pretty much like shopping kind of this thing, and then you have insurance and investments, which kind of takes you to the manage and grow part of it. I think if you design it crisply, cleanly, it becomes super critical. Now, when it comes to figuring out trade-offs, I don't think so that you can chase a particular thing and just solve for it because you think that you are trying to bring in a trade-off on one versus the other.
Yeah.
You need to figure out your overall strategy in a very, very holistic manner where basically those pieces of things are falling into the right sequence and in the right puzzle. I think if you can figure out that, then it is not about the trade-offs, but it is more about following the right strategy around that, right? And this decisions become, I think, if you think holistically around all those dimensions and figure out this is the right sequence for you, then it is never about trade-off. It is about following your strategy the right way. And I think on that particular front, fairly proud of the team. I think at PhonePe, I think we back ourselves up to be able to kind of think very, very holistic around any problem statement, right? And typically, whenever we have entered a field in it to win it mindset, and generally have created success story one after the other across the dimensions wherever we entered.
Thanks, Vishal. Coming to you, Nitya, you were one of the first to bring buy now, pay later to India. And in many ways, you guys started the revolution on consumption financing and checkout products to drive consumption financing in India. I believe one of the biggest hooks that you guys had was the one-click checkout product. I'd imagine one of the challenges that a checkout product faces is how do you continuously have that ongoing engagement with the user? Because I don't necessarily need to download simple app to basically be a simple user. So how do you tackle that challenge? And in that context, how do you maintain and improve on customer engagement? Because as we all know, engagement leads to monetization.
Yeah. As you said, right? Often people think of buy now, pay later as some sort of a singular thing, which is about affordability. What we have built is more like a buy, pay once product, very much like a khata that really stands for user experience around one-click checkout and so on, and then trust, right? Trust while buying things online. Now, a lot of people ask me this question, and actually, when we think about what we are doing today and the long-term opportunity, we think about ourselves as really not actually taking the attention away from retailers, right? Our primary goal is not to increase engagement with Simple. Our primary goal is for Simple to be a platform where retailers can engage with their customers, right? Naturally, by doing so, the engagement with Simple automatically happens, right?
Right.
So therefore, we don't think about it in a slightly more traditional way of just like app and please come to my app, do those things. It is really about building checkout related products across loyalty and various other things and so on. That said, while to use Simple, you don't need to have the Simple app. It is without the app also. 85% of our users automatically end up using the app and downloading the app.
Yeah.
And the reason is, obviously app has a bunch of features around reconciliation of bill, dispute management, paying your bills, etc., which consumers like. As loyalty and some of these things start coming as prominent features, that will automatically happen. Although that's not the primary goal of our product or a company, that we need to get people to engage with the app. That's not the primary goal. So that's number one. The second is again, right, the way we think about ourselves more so is not a product, but a network. And so we think about the engagement metric not as engagement of our product of any one version of Simple like an app, but the engagement with the network itself, right? And so the network is spread across a lot of merchants and of course a lot of consumers. So that's kind of like how we think about it. We think about ourselves as a network first company, and therefore we optimize things around increasing the scale of the network and of course the engagement with the network.
Makes sense. Just continuing on that theme of ongoing customer engagement, Apoorv, Refine, like I said, now is a clear leader in the earned wage access space, which, however, is still a nascent space in India compared to other markets. What I would love to understand is, you are primarily targeting, at least at the moment, a certain segment in terms of affluence and income levels, potentially the lower middle income, lower income segments. So one, how do you really differentiate? Because now you see a slew of these players coming with similar sort of value proposition targeting the same segment. And two, unlike a card product or a payment product, which is a high touch product, your product may not be as high touch because I might need it once, in a month, and then the frequency of engagement, it's more of I'd imagine it's more of an MAU app as opposed to a DAU app, right? So so how important is customer experience really, and engaging with the users? How do you address that challenge?
Sure. So I think first thing, to your last point first, I don't think customer experience is ever a question at this point, whether it's the experience is once in a month or it's daily. People tend to remember the experience that they have. So even if an app were once in a month experience, which a few apps are, they have no reason to have any less of an, in fact, the customer experience becomes even more critical. But to how at Refine we are seeing the usage patterns, I think we are a very, very high engagement app at this point. One of the key realizations we had after launching the product was that people don't come on the app just to transact. It's also to be able to view their earned salary. If you think about it, salary is one of the sacrosanct things that we have in our lives. It's the origin, is the genesis of all personal finance. Everything flows from there, right? And there is no other platform on which you are able to regularly monitor how much you have earned on a monthly basis, see that tangible increase in what you have earned. So what we realized once we launched is that people come on the app not only to access their earned wages, but it's also to see exactly how much they have earned. And that psychologically helps them improve their personal finances. They have a very clear view. If you think about what the cards did, cards are known to do one thing, is that they hide your actual spending ability. And that's why they took off as well. That's one of the downsides of a very high credit limit, which is we are very happy that RBI is regulating things quite a bit there. But that is what we do on the app, is we allow access to people's visibility into people's earnings in real time. So we get quite a bit of engagement on that, but we see ourselves as an ecosystem centered around salary, given that everything flows out of the salary. So once people start accessing their salary through us, viewing their salary on the platform, it allows you to open a lot more other avenues. And again, it's all built on trust. Finance is trust. There is absolutely no two ways about it. If people feel more comfortable coming on a platform, using it, there are going to be a lot more opportunities in the future to upsell and cross sell. Now, and one thing I totally agree with Nitya as well is you have to not necessarily think about engagement on the app. For example, Refine, we not only provide earned wage access through our app, we also integrate into a lot of our employers' applications.
Right.
So the goal is not to necessarily bring traffic onto one particular platform, but create the entire ecosystem, bring earned wage access into light as a solution, as a financial product, which allows people to solve their daily needs. And once that happens, there are a lot of other avenues in which you can engage the customers much better. We see that a lot of people come on the app anyway, but we don't hold people to it. Customer experience is paramount for us. So we embed into whatever platforms we can. We try to reach the customer in the lowest possible friction method, as opposed to what we feel like could be better for our engagement.
Makes sense. And all three of you touched upon this theme of the importance of data, and not just how well you collect it, but also how well you make sense of it and use it. And one thing I was curious about was how big of a moat can data really provide? If you look at the entire customer life cycle, from segmentation to targeting to upsell, cross-sell, underwriting, all of these different things that you go through, data is going to be a key differentiator, I would imagine, especially when compared to large organizations who have a lot of data, but disconnected and not necessarily getting the full power of it, which is where you guys probably have an advantage, given the focus you have on it from day one, and how your information architecture allows you to do that from day one. So would be interesting to hear some examples of use cases or just approaches that you have followed in your respective companies to do this well, to do data and analytics well. Maybe it's free for all, so feel free to jump in. This is a question for all three of you. Do you want to go first, Apoorv?
Sure. So I think we deal with data not only on the customer side, which is the employees that come onto the platform to access their earned wages, but it's also the enterprise. And the moment you get into an enterprise format, data is not only something that you have to treat very, very sensitively, purely because it's your customer's data, but it's also all about your reputation. In enterprise, the reputation is everything. You will not be able to work with any major enterprise if your reputation is not absolutely clean. So that's what we aspire to do. So the way to achieve that is not having data and the mechanism and the tooling around it as an afterthought that you build once, yes, you have the MVP, you're out there. But that's something that we had in mind on day one itself. So we realized that just how critical data is going to be, not just from the analytics perspective or deriving value out of that data, but also from a security perspective and making sure that we are at the forefront of ensuring privacy. If you see what has happened in the lending industry in particular, unfortunately, is data has been abused pretty extensively. A lot of applications out there which ask for access around very, very sensitive things which there should not be. For instance, the media, the gallery, and then we all get to hear those news, right? Again, very happy that soon, hopefully in India, we'll have some data regulation laws around it. But that has happened. And then from day one, we wanted to make sure that we have the bare minimum possible data to provide the best possible experience. And whatever data we do have, we use it with very, very explicit consent of the customer. So we go by the approach of asking rather than assuming. So at every step of the way, it's just a quick nudge to the customer. Hey, are you okay with us doing a particular customer experience optimization using a particular data set? So that's the approach that we have taken. In the background, yes, there is quite a bit of data analytics, AI, and what really helps is that the baseline for these technologies have grown leaps and bounds over the last few years, where the commodity solutions available out there are incredible, whether it's on any of the cloud platforms. So the AI and ML solutions available are very good as is. So that allows you an incredible base to start with, on which you can customize and build very, very effective customer experiences which are data driven.
I think I'll jump in here, and because Apoorv has touched on one of the very important topic here, right? Consent driven data architecture, privacy and security are like literally non-negotiable, right? Given the amount of data which is being generated, given the amount of digital footprint which is available, I think it's high time where companies have to start, I think, on a proactive basis, take a customer first view on the data side and start solving for complete respect to the customers, I think, needs around, right? A, consent, B, the security and the privacy side of it. I think once you take care of that, and that's where basically, if you think about on the digital footprint, the data which is generated is huge, right? Earlier, if you think about in the old age days, right, people used to do a marketing campaign and then wait for how the results are changing and then basically tweak it out in terms of, what marketing product campaigns has to be done or what manufacturing changes has to be done in terms of product variations. In digital footprint, honestly speaking, you can get those numbers in a week's time in terms of try out a particular experiment, test out how basically consumers are reacting to it, and basically find out another tweak. And that's the beauty of it, right? That if you can understand the data really well and segment it out, then you can understand the customer mindset and figure out where each consumer is on the life stage of your product, and figure out the right offering, which is very, very personalized, highly personalized manner in terms of what is needed, when is needed, and basically how you kind of talk about it. So when, what, and hows of it is actually can be solved beautifully if you're looking at and trying to understand your customer as much as possible.
Makes sense. And Nitya, just if you could focus a little bit more on the underwriting side of things, without, of course, giving away your secret sauce, but what are some of the innovations that you're seeing there from a data and analytics perspective?
Yeah. So, as everybody here is obviously data and data-driven personalization is the core of internet products. And obviously we are also in this world where there is just unlimited amount of data exhaust. And in the end, it's customers' data. And there are rules, laws, and obviously ethics to be kept into mind, as in, what are you getting? Why are you getting? Is it with the consent architecture? And then how do you store it, use it, and so on, right? So that being, obviously stated, I think the most important, exciting opportunity, I think, in today's world with mobile internet and big data and machine learning is that we have unlimited compute power on the cloud, right? And if you structure your system or your product in a way where there are continuous feedback loops of data, essentially what happens is your system becomes intelligent over time. One of my favorite examples of this is Google Maps, right? When Google Maps started 10, 12 years ago, it was hardly accurate. Today, in any city in the world, you can literally by the minute know exactly how long it will take for you to get to from point A to point B. And it's scarily accurate, right? If it says 57 minutes, it's more likely going to be 57 minutes. And it's nothing but this whole product architecture, which basically creates these, data network effects across millions and millions and millions, hundreds of millions of consumers around the world. And that's true for anything around payments, right? So when you think about buying online, and so, we very much focus on the internet, right? So we don't do payments on, physical world right now, at least. And the internet is very different from buying experience point of view, which includes the process, of course, and then, of course, the elements of trust than the physical world, right? Physical world, you go to a store, you know what's going on and you buy. But online world, the transaction does not end when you buy. It actually starts when you buy and then ends when you are satisfied. And so every retailer is trying to deliver that consumer experience through the entire life cycle of the transaction, which starts from the checkout experience, ends at returns, refunds, and so on. And it is not just about risk, it's about personalization. And obviously risk is part of it, risk, abuse, trust and safety, and so on, right? Yeah, I mean, like at Simple, what we do is we, I think where we have pioneered something very interesting is when you think about pure credit products, there is a very important element of affordability, right? And we at least at Simple don't do that. So we're not giving you money to buy your phone and computer. It's about food delivery, groceries, clothes, and so on. And therefore, that is a very intent-based problem statement. The risk is in the intent and not the ability that much, right?
Yeah.
To that extent. And so we do behavioral modeling, right? So we use data to model behavior on the internet as opposed to, purely
risk modeling,
risk, that in that way. And the modeling is around, obviously, will you pay or not? Will you accept delivery or not? Will you return or not? Because all of that feeds into the system, and then of course an output comes out, right? And it's really different for different people and different for different people in different context, right? When you're buying t-shirt online is very different from buying food online and so on, right? So yeah, I mean, data and data-driven intelligence is core to what we do. But I think more importantly, what I wanted to emphasize was it's really about creating a vicious circle of a system, which basically with time just gets better and more accurate and more better for consumers, at the same time weed away the abusers over time.
Makes sense. It's a very interesting topic once you get to the use cases. Just want to switch gears a little bit. And one of the things that I hear a lot of startup founders talk a lot about, and what investors are also focused on, is the CAC upon LTV model, right? So how much you're spending on customer acquisition versus what you project to be the lifetime value of your customer. Now, this is especially important, I guess, in an industry where consumers are looking for instant gratification, and there's a lot of cashbacks and discounts, and it's, you can't run away from it. It's core to your acquisition strategy, no matter what business you are in. That's the fastest, short way to acquire a bunch of users and gain that initial scale. How do you think about this? How do you balance this? And as you scale and you start focusing on unit economics and minimizing CAC upon LTV, how do you translate this behavior of instant gratification to then building loyalty and therefore increasing spends or whatever your metric is, right? How do you make sure that happens? And again, this is a question for all of you, so feel free to jump in.
Let me jump in here first. And if you think about, I think one of the most important thing is that unit economics can never be afterthought, right? It has to be baked into the first stage itself. I think as long as you're clear in terms of how you're going to build it, I think solving for customer acquisition to kind of, acquire and then create habits out of it. I think it's a proven formula, and people have done that multiple number of times. But you need to be very, very clear about in terms of how intelligent and how sharp you're about it, right? And that's where the entire data plays out. If you understand your customer and figure out what do they need, many times you don't need to incentivize for, solving for their needs, right? And then once you've solved that, and once you've created the right engagement, again, you need to figure out that, do I need to kind of, start using the incentive as straight away first stage or first step itself? And there are different use cases, right? There is no, I think, standard playbook answer for this particular thing. For each of the use cases, the answer will vary. But again, I think it is all about, have you understand the customer need, and have you understand the trigger points in terms of why a consumer will basically solve for it, or what will be the hook. And if you can do that, I think that becomes, super critical. And for us, honestly speaking, the choice have been very simple. When we entered into the ecosystem and started building the payments ecosystem for the country, P2P was a kind of unsolved need, right? And when we basically partner with NPCI and start building for the UPI, I think that bet has really, really paid off well, right? If you think from in the last 5 years, post demon, what has happened on the overall digital payments, it has become a way of life, right? Honestly speaking, not only in cities, but even in small towns, you can go out of your home without carrying your wallet, as simple as that. So it has naturally become the daily habit. Now, from here onwards, how do you kind of solve or focus for the LTV of the consumer? Is basically, that's where basically you need to understand the when and what and how of it, right? If you think of consumer life cycle, which is send, spend, manage, grow, I was talking about. If you understand that, and if you think of that consumer is on the journey of that life cycle, then you need to understand and figure out what are the right intersection points where you can go and talk to the customer about a particular offering, and basically see that engagement is leading to a particular conversion or eventually LTV increase. But yeah, I think if you start with the right focus, where unit economics not an afterthought, you can always build a great, I think, CAC to LTV story. And I think we have proven it across every category what we've entered in.
Any other thoughts on this? Apoorv, Nitya?
Yeah, I'll quickly, I mean, like, obviously, the goal of any business is to make money, right? Without that, you can't do it at scale or over a long period of time. And I think the most important thing is, how do you, of course, at different stages of the business, you are at different times where you're still figuring out what LTV is, right? And I think one rule of thumb that we have used is less about LTV, more about payback period, right? I mean, how much time does it take for you to sort of like get payback on some sort of spend, right? Because the thing, as Vishal pointed out, in any internet product, you can obviously, as you engage the customer, build loyalty with them, you can give them more products and therefore over time increase LTV, but a lot of it is sort of in the future. So I guess the right number to focus on is not LTV to CAC, but more like payback ratio, have some sense of your business. I think, I mean, there are urban, there are thoughts around what should be the right number, but I believe it really matters on what the business you are trying to build and how much of a time horizon you have. But I think that's probably the right number to think about. And as you're building your business and then eventually monetizing over the long period of time.
Right. Apurv, anything to add from your side?
Absolutely. So I think on the LTV side, there is no doubt that is an indicator of what sort of retention that you have on your platform, and ultimately the business model itself, right? Like Vishal said, it can't be an afterthought from day one when you're thinking about your business. You need to have some roadmap. Of course, a lot of optimizations, a lot of innovation happens on the way, but you need to have some roadmap of how you're creating that LTV. Now, CAC also in a lot of ways operates orthogonally, where there are a lot of ways in which you can optimize on CAC. And this is where we are seeing quite a bit of innovation happening in the industry, where the standard D2C approaches of advertising are not being assumed as to end all be all, right? For instance, the approach that we took for being able to reach out to our end customers is through the employers.
Yeah,
that dramatically reduces the CAC for us and allows us to ultimately have a lot more buffer if we are able to provide certain offerings to the customer. That CAC can be used in a different mechanism. And once you have that sort of customer base, of course, the engagement becomes key. But you can then start to optimize your CAC and start taking a bit of it and also use it to engage the customer in a particular way. That has been done in the industry in the form of cashbacks, in the form of discounts, but it has typically come as an additional cost on top of the CAC and not just as a part of the standard CAC, because that becomes, if discounts and cashbacks are your go-to mechanism, that's an ongoing expenditure. It's not a standard customer acquisition cost. So what we try to think about is, okay, how do we optimize on the initial CAC? And then if we have some sort of a buffer from that, can we allow customers greater retention by using that amount while keeping the business sustainable? But like everyone here mentioned, I think at the end of the day, you have to think very deeply about the LTV, because that's a representation of the value that you are able to add. And it's also around, can you build products which just have a ridiculous amount of retention? If you think about things like credit score, how many times have you kept your civil? Has anyone used civil website really? But ultimately, the value is has been generated for the customers who do have a civil score. One of the things that we are working on right now is the refined score, in which we take into account people's behavior patterns at work and how they have been able to improve in their careers, and then basically create a score for them. Now that creates an amazing amount of retention for us. So the LTV operates alongside engagement and retention. There are certain products will not generate direct revenue, but a lot of indirect revenue.
Yeah, makes sense. Final question, since we have a few minutes left, and just as you scale to becoming a large company, how do you avoid the pitfalls of what we understand a legacy company stands for, right? Whether it's the type of talent that you will need to attract, retain, or the type of tech agility that you will need, the type of data analytics and the power of that you will need. All of these things, how do you think about scaling? Again, keeping customer experience in mind and the ability to deliver that consistently over time. What can you learn from the big banks
I think it's easy for us to answer because we are not even close to being a legacy company in any way.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it's from what I think, it's first principles thinking that will never stray you down the wrong path. If you ask all the right questions. So and the questions do not change from day one of the company, right? Like ultimately, what is the value that you are able to provide to the customer, and are you doing it in the most efficient possible way? Is there a better way to achieve that? So starting from the first principles thinking always helps, and assuming that there is always a better way to do it.
Right.
There is typically a lot of innovation to be done. We are not even close to the optimized plan. Like Nitya also mentioned, there are so many things in life which can end up becoming no experiences. So zero is the absolute best that we should look for. And there's quite a bit of room there.
How about you, Nitya?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like that's something. I mean, we are also not that close to being an incumbent yet, but if we keep on doing well, we will be an incumbent at some point, right? And the goal has to be doing things now and promoting a culture that will always keep us on the toes. So the two things I strongly believe in, and we try our best to inculcate in our company is, the biggest competitive advantage in life is long-term thinking. And it's true for businesses, products, or relationships, or anything else. And if you just have a long-term horizon, then you will just do things differently than if you were not, right? So that's number one, and always keep that. Now, keeping that is actually very hard because naturally we are, as human beings, more tuned to what happens tomorrow as opposed to 10 years out. And so therefore you have to have a culture of and incentive structures that makes people behave so, right? And then that creates the sort of like culture of innovation and risk taking and responsibility and so on. So I think that's sort of like the most important thing. The world is changing. Everybody who's disruptor today will not be a disruptor if they keep on doing the same thing. So they have to always reinvent themselves because there is someone else who's coming up with a different insight and hungrier and faster and smaller and ready to take more risk. So yeah, I think that's those are the two things that we think about a lot.
Great. And Vishal, final words. I mean, you guys have, I know how many employees strong now, but how do you maintain that culture of innovation that everyone is talking about?
Yeah, so interestingly, I've been lucky enough to be part of Indian startup ecosystem for almost all my career, right, barring one this thing. In fact, part of the 3 stories where we scaled those 3 organizations, right, Pine Labs, Flipkart, and now PhonePe, seen what it takes to kind of build great organizations and operate at scale, right? I think the key answer lies in 2 main things, according to me. One is the org design, how you think about your org design, because when I think it's fairly easy to solve things at a smaller scale, right? It becomes way more complex. Even the simplest of the problems become way more complex when you're operating at scale. I think how do you kind of design yourself to keep it simple, right, and still retain lots of those things which basically every startup has and everybody enjoys, right? How do you do that? That's one aspect of it, and probably I'll go one level deeper into it. But let me touch on the second aspect, which basically Nitya also touched on. The second is the culture, right? In terms of what kind of culture you're creating in the organization, in order to create the behavior of everybody in terms of how do they think about the organization, how do they behave with each other, what kind of I think values and ethos you are driving. On the coming back to the first part, org design. Let's say, for example, in PhonePe, what we've done is we have kind of arranged ourselves in a pod structure. So each of the business lines, if you think about, and because we being in payments, right, the opportunity and the number of areas what we have entered is far too many, right? And I think the main reason we have succeeded in all of them is because we've designed ourselves into smaller groups, right, which is like self-sufficient team. And every resource or every kind of function which is required, there is a dedicated set of people, and it's like a cliched statement, but pretty much startup within the startup, right? And if you can kind of maintain that agility in that group, it solves for 2 things, right? One is your information asymmetry is way lesser, right? Because everybody who needs to work together are sitting together and dedicated for that particular thing. And that becomes super critical. The second, it also allows you to kind of give a little bit of flexibility where you're not kind of mapping out your organization basis one formula, because if you're grouped on this thing, then each of the function which is in a different life stage, right? Where it can be 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 or 10 to 100, gets lots of freedom within to operate based on the need of their life stage rather than the company's life stage. Right?
Yeah.
So that autonomy which is being created because of the pod being there, the information symmetry which is being solved, and basically that process independence, what you're trying to give, right? According to us, that has been working out really, really well. For each of our pods, there are like multiple companies around, if you think from that lens, right? But despite of that, I think we've been able to scale like a startup, primarily from that design and the culture.
Perfect. Let's end on that note. It resonates so much with advisors like us, especially for large companies where we try and this is one of the biggest challenges: the operating model, the org model, and maintaining that culture of innovation. But very interesting, insightful discussion, gentlemen. If I were to just take the liberty of just recapping some takeaways for me personally, at least in the last 2 minutes, I think number one, like all three of you mentioned, we keep talking about customer experience, but we need to understand that customer experience has become table stakes. It's not your main differentiator anymore. It's a hygiene factor, if anything. And I quite like the point that you all made about the best customer experience being zero experience or no experience. So that's something to keep in mind while you design your product. And I think one of the things that is common across all three of you is just questioning age-old traditions or how things are supposed to be when you define your value proposition. Why does it have to be? The example you gave, Apoorv, on why does salary accounts have to be that way? And some of the key enablers that you guys spoke about. One, thinking about your hook for acquisition and thinking about customer lifetime value and unit economics from day one is going to be important, even as you invest in customer experience on an ongoing basis. We touched upon data science and the importance of data science, engineering, and analytics from day one, and the design and engineering aspect of it as well. And last but not the least, the point that you all made around how to scale as an organization, creating those agile, cross-functional squads or pods that are self-sufficient so that you create startups within startups and you don't lose that edge that you had when you were small as you scale. Well, those are my takeaways on how you continue to innovate on customer experience. Thank you for this session. Thank you so much for tuning in to ET India and Boardroom. Stay tuned for more.